everybody, it's Corey with Ascend Smarter Intervention, and today I wanted to open up a conversation and talk with you guys a little bit about dyslexia and diagnosing dyslexia. So this month has been Dyslexia Awareness Month, so we've been spending a lot of time really diving into what is this, how do we recognize it, what does it look like in the classroom, how can parents start to recognize this at home. And today we really wanted to just wrap up this month by talking about diagnosis, because I think that there are a lot of questions and there are a lot of challenges. So in the blog this week, what we talked about was 3 primary challenges in diagnosing dyslexia. One of the first questions that comes up is, who actually diagnoses this? So a lot of times what happens is parents will start to have concerns because they'll recognize that reading isn't coming naturally, it's not coming easily. Maybe they have more than one child and they've recognized, wow, it came so much easier for my other children than it has for this child. Or there's just some kind of red flag. It feels like, homework or reading is a struggle, kids are crying, something feels off. And so what they'll do is they'll go to the school to say, hey, I think my child may have some type of problem. Maybe parents have done some research and have said, you know what, maybe it could be dyslexia. And then what happens is, as school-based professionals, we get a little bit nervous because depending on how open the district and the school is, we kind of get that, oh, we can't talk about that. That's not something that we say here. It's not something that we diagnose here. And so parents become confused because they're like, well, but my child's not reading and the school's job is to help my child learn to read. So where do I go? What do I do if this isn't something that can be addressed by the school? And so often what happens is, teachers will say, well, dyslexia is a medical diagnosis. That's something that needs to happen through your doctor. And so then parents will go to the doctor or the pediatrician, and the pediatrician says, well, that's a school-based issue that needs to be handled by the school. And so there's a disconnect between where do I go to actually get this solved? And so that's something that we really need to create awareness around from the schools, is where do we go? And from the doctors and the primary care providers, where do they send people when they struggle with not being able to get a diagnosis? So one of the things that is important to recognize is, who does diagnose dyslexia? You can get a diagnosis through a clinical psychologist, an educational psychologist, a neuropsychologist, speech language pathologist, educational diagnostician. There are a few others who may be able to diagnose depending on their background, their training, their qualifications, but those would be some of the primary places that could get that done, or the primary people who could get that done. What you'll want to make sure of is, can you actually give me a coded diagnosis? Are we going to get a DSM code? Are we going to get an ICD-10 code? Those are just those medical terms for actually having that diagnosis, because sometimes what will happen is you'll go somewhere and they'll sort of say it's a dyslexia evaluation, but then they just give strengths and weaknesses and they don't actually provide that diagnosis, which you need in order to qualify for things like a 504 plan through the school, or to be able to qualify for accommodations like ACT, SAT, College Board accommodations. So that's important that you make sure that you go to somebody who can actually give you the formal diagnosis. Then the next question becomes, well, what do schools call this? If schools are saying that they don't recognize dyslexia, well, then what are they calling it? Because I think that there's a lot of struggle around semantics of what are we calling this? And so at the school, and truly even the switch in the medical diagnosis has actually changed to calling it specific learning disability in reading. And so sometimes I think what happens is parents will get upset because they feel like you're not addressing this as what it is, and it is dyslexia. Dyslexia and a specific learning disability in reading are generally interchangeable terms. Not always. Sometimes we might have a specific reading disability in reading comprehension, and that's a little bit different. But for the most part, those two terms are synonymous, and the way that we're going to support it through research-based instruction is the same. So I think we can let go of that concern around the semantics there. And then the final big question that a lot of professionals have, and parents as well, because they're wondering, what does a dyslexia diagnosis look like? What type of assessments are needed to be given so that we can make sure that our students are actually assessed appropriately? And so the things that we're always looking at when we're looking at a dyslexia diagnosis and what needs to go into that is that dyslexia is truly difficulty with reading or writing, really at the single word level, that's caused by a difficulty in specific areas of our literacy processing triangle. And if you follow us, you know that we are obsessed with the literacy processing triangle. So the idea being that literacy comes from three distinct places or parts in the brain, three distinct categories that we need to have pulling together and making neural connections in order to read and write with efficiency and ease. And so those three spots are semantics or language processing, phonology, which is the sound structure processing, and orthography, which is the visual print processing. So those three things have to come together in a triangle with speed and automaticity in order for reading and writing to come easily. And so what we need to do when we are assessing for dyslexia is we need to make sure that we are assessing all areas of reading and writing specifically, and then that we're getting a very clear picture of language processing, that semantics processor, a clear picture of orthography or a student's ability to recognize visual print, and then also phonology, so a student's ability to understand the sound structure of the language. When we're looking at reading, we want to make sure that we're looking at reading single words, we're reading fluency, and that we have reading comprehension. So when we're looking at single word reading, we want to make sure that we're assessing both real words and nonsense words, because we want to get rid of some of that visual memory. And so by assessing nonsense words, we can get rid of that visual memory. Then we can also take a look at timed versus untimed. So we want to make sure that we're looking at a student's automaticity as opposed to how much can they labor through all of that. So those are going to be important pieces that we're looking at when we are looking at the sound structure or at the reading structure for a student's abilities. Then we're going to want to look at writing. So we're going to want to do the same thing. We're going to look at spelling. So we're looking at spelling at the single word level. This is really going to help us to see if they can really have that reciprocity in reading and writing. So we want to see what a student's reading ability at the single word looks like versus their spelling at the single word. So that's really important. Then when we go back to that reading side, we want to look at their reading fluency. So once we get out of that single word ability, we want to see how are they doing in connected text. It is critical that we are doing oral reading fluency. So a lot of reading fluency assessments will actually allow students to silently, they have like silent reading fluency tests. That's not sufficient, because what we need to know is we need to know what type of errors are being made, and we need to be recording those errors. So it's very, very important. Then what we want to do on the flip side of that is we want to be looking at writing. We want to be looking at sentence structure and syntax. Are students able to put together sentence level and beyond, but what does their syntax look like? And that's really going to be that reciprocity between that, that reading fluency. We want to be able to look at their ability to put together syntactically correct sentences. Then we really want to move on to the passage level. So if we flip back to reading, we want to make sure that we're looking at their passage level reading, and we want to understand what are they comprehending? What are they able to pull? How does that look? And we'll jump into this when we get into language, but how does that look in comparison to what's happening with what they can understand orally? On the flip side to that, we also want to look at what they're writing. So we need to look at some type of essay or paragraph level writing so that we can see how are they able to conceptualize information, process it, and put that down onto paper. So that's going to be your reciprocal process there. So the big thing that we need to make sure that we're doing is that we're looking at all areas of reading, all areas of writing, and that we have the reciprocal piece to each side so that we can see both pieces. How are they reading? How are they writing? Two sides to the same coin, we need to know both. Then we need to look at that literacy processing triangle. So we need to look at language processing, orthographic, visual processing, and then phonological processing, so that sound structure. For the semantics piece, it's ideal if you have a speech language pathologist doing an evaluation. That's fantastic because they can do a lot more of that language processing to get into the nitty-gritty. That being said, you may also have people who do not necessarily have a speech background, and therefore we need to make sure that we at least have a basic level of understanding of language processing. So, like I was mentioning before with the reading comprehension, we need to have an oral comprehension measure. We need to see what the difference is between what students are understanding when they just hear the information versus when they're required to read the information. We need to see what that discrepancy looks like. We also want to have a general idea of what their receptive and expressive vocabulary looks like. So receptive vocabulary, what they're understanding, what they're taking in, and expressive vocabulary, what they're able to push out. Dyslexic profiles have some really interesting pieces that we may see in some of this, and so it's important to know what those pieces look like, because that's also going to help guide instruction, and it's also going to guide what accommodations and modifications are most appropriate. One of the common accommodations that we see for students with dyslexia is that they have access to audiobooks. Audiobooks are fantastic. However, if you have a student who has poor oral comprehension or poor listening comprehension, it does not make sense to use audiobooks as a sole accommodation because they're not actually getting more information when they're hearing it. So it's really important to know what that breakdown looks like. And you can have a lot of different profiles that still fit within dyslexia, but it may look very different from student to student or child to child. So that's going to be really important. It's really great if we can get more information than that, but at a very basic level, we need to at least have that. Then when we look at that phonological awareness or that phonological processing, we like to use the comprehensive test of phonological processing. Sometimes it's not as sensitive as we would like, but we do need to understand how are students able to break words into sounds, break words into syllables, put syllables together, put sounds together. We need to know that as soon as a student can recognize a letter, they can tie a sound to it, that they're going to be able to string those sounds together to create words. That's ultimately one of the key breakdowns in students with dyslexia. And so we need to have some idea of what does that processing look like and how automatic is it? So not just can they do it, but can they do it effectively and efficiently? When we give a CTOP, we give the whole thing. So I know a lot of people who are familiar with that test say, well, do you just give certain pieces of it? Nope, we give the whole thing, because in order to provide appropriate intervention services on the back end, we need to know what every single one of those phonological processing pieces look like. And we want to make sure that we have a clear picture of their rapid naming ability, which is moving into that orthographic ability that we talked about, that visual. So how quickly can I visually look at letters and be able to say, that's an A, that's a T, that's a B, that's an S? Because what happens is the brain needs to be able to make that quick visual recognition to then tie a sound, to then blend the sounds together, to then tie meaning. So you can kind of see how that whole thing's coming. And so for us, for that orthographic piece, we're definitely relying pretty heavily on that rapid naming component, as well as that spelling component. A lot of pieces are really tying into that orthography, but that's why it's going to be really important that we focus there. Another thing that you could do in order to look at that orthography is also to give sound symbol tests, just to see, do students recognize that OI says oi, or that DGE says j? Those types of things would be good orthographic assessments as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be specifically a test of orthographic competence. I know that they do have some tests of that, which is great if you want to incorporate that, but you definitely don't have to. So if you're interested in knowing specifically which assessments that we use, I know I just threw out the CTOP there, we use a number of assessments in our diagnostic batteries, but jump into our blog. I linked it here so that you could take a look at that and you can see what that looks like. And we're happy to open up this conversation if you have questions about any of the things. If you have questions about who can diagnose, what does that look like? What is the school calling it? Or what assessments should I be using? Feel free to drop those questions in the comments. We are more than happy to be answering any of those questions. And if you want to comment in the blog as well, we'll make sure to get back to you so you can feel really confident in this, because we find it's so critical that more people are aware of what this needs to look like. So that's that. Again, if you have questions, we love talking about this. We'd love to open the conversation. And if not, at least go check out the blog. There's lots of good information there. And next week, we're going to be in November. So we are going to be shifting focus a little bit off of dyslexia into some of the other learning disabilities that you might be seeing in the classroom or as a parent with your child at home. So have an awesome day, and we'll check back in next week.